All right, I want to welcome everybody back to the third session, the third part of Black Studies with me, The Forecast. And if you missed either of the previous videos, you might want to go back and check it. It makes a lot more sense when you watch them all in order. But I do want to thank everybody, and I appreciate all the support and love y'all been showing me. Now, last time we looked at the expanding slave trade. We saw how Black leaders, African leaders, and leaders in the Americas responded. We talked about, Africans selling other Africans, and what do we think about that? Especially how people try to frame it. And we also looked at that brief window, that 10 to 20 to 30 year period in what became America, where it was possible for enslaved Black people to accept the ways of the Englishmen and adopt to Christianity and could possibly get their freedom. But we saw how that window quickly closed, and the whole process from indentured servitude to straight up slavery. And we saw the 1667 baptism law, which officially ended Black people gaining their freedom by converting to Christianity. That no longer worked after 1667. So now that we see these race-based politics and laws take shape, this week we're going to look at the laws and the practices Europeans used to maintain and establish a race-based society and essentially the rise of whiteness. Now, even though the British came onto the scene late compared to the Portuguese and Spanish, by the late 1660s, the English colony of Virginia began to create strict laws only for Black people, where they began to single out Black people. Slaves were forbidden from leaving the plantation without a pass, and they could never leave on Sundays. And later, we'll see how Black people use Sundays and certain holidays to their advantage, usually when Europeans' guard was down. But they were forbidden from owning weapons. But most importantly, different forms of communication was banned between slaves. They went as far as banning horns and whistles or anything that slaves could use to communicate. Now, obviously, if you're trying to enslave a group of people, it's important to keep them from being able to communicate. And not only were language barriers a problem, the laws that were created and essentially the mentality that was beat into us was all designed to keep us separated, because the name of the game is divide and conquer. Because if slaves were able to communicate and they had ways to communicate with other slaves from different plantations, of course they're going to talk about freeing themselves. And it's very important to make sure that doesn't happen. Now, to ensure they maintain control, in 1669, Virginia passed the Casual Killing Act.
In October 1669, the Virginia Assembly enacted a law removing criminal penalties for people who killed slaves that resisted authority. That practice would not be considered murder because the, quote, premeditated malice, unquote, element of murder could not be formed against one's own property. In the following years, Virginia continued to reduce protection for slaves. In 1723, the Assembly removed all penalties for the killing of slaves. That meant that an enslaved person could be killed for an offense as minor as picking bad tobacco. In effect, enslavers could kill enslaved people with impunity in colonial-era Virginia. Laws in the other colonies were also weak when it came to protecting the lives of slaves. Following the American Revolution, many states created penalties for killing slaves. But the loophole permitting the killing of an enslaved person during, quote, correction, or to prevent resistance, remained. As a result, slave owners were rarely punished for killing enslaved people throughout the history of slavery in America.
Now, I know a lot of us have heard about the Casual Killing Act, and a lot of people say it affects policing even till this day. Now, I do want to ask if you have heard of the Casual Killing Act. Do you think it's still in effect with today's policing? And if so, how? And if not, why don't you think so? And when do you think it stopped? Now, the Casual Killing Act said if any slave resisted, and there's a familiar word we still hear today where they tell you, you shouldn't have resisted, stop resisting. But anyway, if a slave resists his master or anyone sent by the master and they are killed during quote unquote correction, or if they're killed while they're being disciplined, then it cannot be a crime since it's assumed that there was no malice intent. Now, they said even if they kill somebody, they just have to assume that it wasn't malice, as long as they say that they were correcting them or trying to discipline them, or if they say they were resisting arrest. Now, this law also legalized raping black women and children, and men for that matter, because they said they couldn't assume malicious intent when they were molesting somebody. Now, I don't know how you assume that molesting a child, a woman, or a man isn't malicious, but they said that you need malicious intent to charge somebody with a felony. Therefore, it wasn't a crime. Now, many say the Casual Killing Act, and listen to those words put together, casual killing. But many people say that this Casual Killing Act was for the benefit of white women who were extremely violent towards black women, black children, and especially mulatto children. And imagine being a white woman and your husband prefers a Negro slave woman, a black woman, over you, or even a child over you. And you see your husband with a bunch of mulatto children running around, even though they enslaved them. And white women were so cruel to these children and killing so many children that they had to pass this law to protect them.
1800s, there was an act called the Casual Killing Act in Virginia. And what this was a law that said that if you killed someone, black, as a result of correcting them, but it would not be considered a felony, but anyone accused, so giving that punishment would be basically free of any punishment or any wrongdoing. Now then, of course, if one looks closely, we go, who then were they trying to protect that was beating someone to death so frequently that you needed a law to protect them? And that would be white women who were beating black children to death. Because, well, whose children were they really?
And this pissed a lot of rich white women off, to have a husband who's no longer sexually attracted to you, but is out making 6, 10, 12, 15 kids with some enslaved African woman. So these white women would take out their frustrations on the bodies of these innocent children who did nothing more than simply exist. You ever watch Looney Tunes or Tex Avery cartoons and you see somebody get hit in the head with a frying pan, hit in the head with a rolling pin, had hot water poured on them, had hot grease poured on them, poke them in the eye, Three Stooges style? These are the things that rich white women would do to these caramel-colored babies. So many mixed-race babies were being killed at the hands of white women that something had to be done, because you couldn't arrest a white woman because that's just simply unheard of. So in October of 1669, King Charles II of England created the Casual Killing Act. Pause to read. In so many words, it says that any slave who resists his master, mistress, or overseer and is killed because you resisted correction, then the person who killed you gets away scot-free. And this was created in order to prevent white women from seeing any punishment from killing innocent black babies. And this essentially fixed the problem of white women killing black people. They could say that, oh, this slave resisted correction and died in the process of me correcting him. And they got away scot-free. Which is partially the reason why police say stop resisting. Because if you are killed for resisting their correction, and they told you to stop resisting, that justifies your death.
Now, the act also included a law that took away black people's ability to defend themselves legally. if a Negro or mulatto, whether they were free or enslaved, lift their hands in self-defense against a Christian or a white person, which is what they called them, then they were sentenced to 30 lashes on their bare back. And every time they defended themselves, they were sentenced to 30 lashes. Now, by 1670, Virginia just started counting every black person that was coming into the colony by ship as a slave. And to make sure there was a distinction between black slaves and white servants, Virginia passed a law that said no slave owner can give any slave freedom unless they deported them out of the colony. And if a European married a black person or a mulatto, they were kicked out the colony themselves. Now you already see a clear distinction between black people, black slaves, and white servants. Because you often hear people say, well, white people came here as slaves too. And I know you've heard the Irish say we were slaves too, which is not true. And for one, white servants couldn't be stripped naked and whipped, unlike black slaves. And although they had a lower status in the society, it was certainly above what they classified as Negro. Now, Virginia made it clear who perpetual slavery was intended for. And they eventually passed a law that said free Negroes and Indians were forbidden from owning Christians or white servants. But they were still allowed to buy their own people. Now, we're going to get into this servant versus slave thing in a minute. But you remember last time when we talked about the Pilgrims, these self-righteous Bible thumpers who were supposedly escaping religious persecution themselves and came over here and set up their own colony in the North. And they were the first colony to officially legalize slavery in 1641. But in 1670, these Pilgrims passed a law as sick as it was as devastating to the black family. Now, these fake self-righteous Pilgrims were the first to legalize selling children and separating families. While these sick so-called Puritans pushed the Bible, they were the first ones to start selling children alone, separating them from their parents as babies and very young children.
In 1641, Massachusetts passed its Body of Liberties, which gave legal sanction to certain kinds of slavery. There shall never be any bond slavery, villanage, or captivity amongst us, unless it be lawful captives taken in just wars, and such strangers as willingly sell themselves or are sold to us. And these shall have all the liberties and Christian usages which the law of God established in Israel concerning such persons doth morally require. This exempts none from servitude who shall be judged thereto by authority. Wiesek notes that the reference to strangers is derived from Leviticus 25:39-55 and explains that they could be ruled and sold as slaves. For the Puritans and citizens of the colony, strangers would eventually mean Native Americans and Africans. Even though the Body of Liberties excluded many forms of slavery, it did recognize four legitimate bases of slavery. Slaves could legally be obtained if they were captives resulting from war, sold themselves into slavery, were purchased as slaves from elsewhere, or were sentenced to slavery through the governing authority. This made Massachusetts the first colony to authorize slavery through legislation. In 1670, Massachusetts made it legal for the children of slaves to be sold into bondage. By 1680, the colony had laws restricting the movements of blacks. A 1703 law required owners to post a bond for all slaves to protect towns in the case that a slave became indigent should the master refuse to continue caring for him or her.
Now, many of the Pilgrims who were coming to America at this time was coming from places in the Caribbean like the West Indies and Barbados, and they brought a lot of the slave codes with them. Now, by 1661, the slave codes in Barbados denied black people even the most basic rights. And the law often referred to black people as heathens, as brutish and dangerous. And black people certainly couldn't get a fair trial with a jury of their own peers. Now, if a black person, whether they were free or enslaved, but if they tried to protect themselves, they called it offering violence. And they said if you quote unquote offer violence to any Christian or a white person, they'll be severely whipped by the constable the first time. The second time, they'll have their noses slit and then burn part of their face with the iron. Now, if there was a third time, it likely resulted in death.
The museum documents how the British established a brutal model of slavery here that would soon be exported to other colonies.
Okay, so let's see if I can find them here for you.
It was known as the Slave Code, a system of laws and punishments which would become the model for slavery in America.
This volume makes it very clear that Africans were property, they were not individual human beings. And the question might occur, why were laws needed? Well, a very simple situation occurs where within 20 years of the establishment of a sugar economy in the island, the enslaved population outnumbered in a very significant way the white plantocracy. And they felt the need for a certain level of control.
Shortly after getting into the colony, you see change over time where the majority of the population are people of African descent. And so these English colonists are controlling their property. So they create these slave codes that dictate status, limits of freedom, what types of abuses can be imparted upon people of African descent if they attempt to run away or if they are seen as unruly.
If any Negro or slave whatsoever shall offer any violence to any Christian by striking or the like, such Negro or slave shall for his or her first offense be severely whipped by the constable. For a second offense of that nature, he shall be severely whipped, his nose slit, and be burned in some part of his face with a hot iron.
But whether in the Caribbean or Africa or America, you see that there's a race between Europeans to conquer land, enslave people, and instill resources. So in 1672, King Charles II of England restructured the Royal African Company, which was created in 1660. And the Royal African Company dominated the slave trade in North America for nearly half a century. Now, Charles II also issued a charter giving the British the right to occupy land, maintain troops, and exercise martial law in West Africa. And between 1660 and 1690, at least 15 Lord Mayors of London were shareholders in the company. And according to their records, by the 1680s, they were trafficking nearly 5,000 people to the quote-unquote New World every year. And most of that was to the Caribbean and places like the West Indies. Now, of course, their goal was to steal silver and gold and to kidnap as many people as they could.
The Royal African Company was an English mercantile company set up in 1660 by the Royal Stuart family and City of London merchants to trade along the west coast of Africa. It was led by the Duke of York, who was the brother of Charles II, and later took the throne as James II. It shipped more African slaves to the Americas than any other institution in the history of the Atlantic slave trade. Its original purpose was to exploit the gold fields up the Gambia River, which were identified by Prince Rupert during the interregnum. It was established after Charles II gained the English throne in the Restoration of 1660. It soon developed and led a brutal and sustained slave trade. It extracted other commodities, mainly from the Gold Coast. In 1752, RAC's assets were transferred to the New African Company of Merchants, which lasted until 1821. Originally known as the Company of Royal Adventurers Trading to Africa, by its charter, issued in 1660, it was granted a monopoly over English trade along the west coast of Africa, with the principal objective being the search for gold.
Now, see, a lot of this part gets complicated because of the infighting and, just the whole history of Europeans fighting each other and white-on-white crime. And another part of Europeans uniting and working together to conquer more land. But they were all in competition to colonize as much as they could. And by the way, as a side note, around the 1650s, European Jews were able to move back to England just a few years before the Royal African Company took off. Now, before the Royal African Company, it was the Dutch East India Company, which was created in 1602, and later the West India Company in 1621, which was created by the Dutch. Now, the Dutch was under Spanish control, but during this time, they were fighting the Spanish for independence. And they were able to establish their own colonies in the West Indies and in North America. Under the East Indian Company, they established New Netherland in 1614, which was basically areas from Pennsylvania, Delaware, Connecticut, etc. And then they also created New Amsterdam in 1624, which is New York. Now, again, the more you study about European tribal wars and alliances, the more this part makes sense. But like I said, they all competed. And for a time, the Portuguese was winning. For a time, the Spanish, then the British, then the Dutch. And also, if you pay attention to the history of European Jews, you can see their involvement in it, as much as they like to downplay it. Now, understand, a lot of the Dutch, just like many other Europeans, was considering expelling the Jews as well. And it's the same old thing. They felt like they was corrupting and trying to take over. And in the beginning, the East India Company didn't even want a Jewish person on their board. But as the company began to expand and make money, European Jews started to invest in the company so much that they became the primary stockholders. Basically, European Jews own most of the stock. And they profited off of the East Indian Company, as well as the West Indian Company. And when the West Indian Company was created, there were many Jewish people on the board. Now, most of the Dutch leaders didn't even want Jewish people to be able to come to New Amsterdam. They wanted them outlawed. But they eventually had to give in because of their investment in the West Indian Company. Because Jewish people accounted for so much of the capital in the company, and as well as the leaders in the company, that they stood up for them and they said, no, you're going to allow them to come to New Amsterdam. And by 1654, the first Jew came to New Amsterdam. And soon a lot of Jewish merchants came to the area, along with the Dutch merchants. Now, for a brief time, the Dutch and the Jewish merchants dominated the slave trade, but they eventually lost to the Spanish. And with the creation of the Royal African Company, the British gained more power. Now, by 1672, we start to see the ways that they deal with runaway slaves begin to change and become a lot more strict. Essentially, Virginia doubled down on the Casual Killing Act and gave permission to the Slave Patrol, aka the Paddy Rollers, to wound or kill any black person that resisted arrest. Now, doesn't that sound familiar? The state giving the Slave Patrol Paddy Rollers the power to kill or wound anybody who they say is resisting arrest. Now, in a way, this law in 1672 gave black people more protection than we had today. Because if a black person got injured or killed by the Slave Patrol while they were being arrested, they had to compensate their owner since they were somebody else's property. So the fact that black people were white people's property gave them an extra level of protection, although they still would be killed. But they were more careful because they would have to compensate the slave owner. Now, today, I'm not sure if they have to compensate, but, you know, you let me know if you think these laws are still on the books with the Casual Killing Act. Now, for as bad as the Virginia colony was, the Pilgrims in Massachusetts was trying their best to be the worst. And for a long time, this war has been an economic war. So to ensure that black people were unable to provide and sustain for themselves, the Pilgrims in Massachusetts passed a law forbidding Christians or white people from engaging in commerce or trade with black people, whether they were free or enslaved. So even if you were a free black man in Massachusetts, the Pilgrims said white people could not do business with you at all. although you can still do business with other black people. But with all the rules against free and enslaved black people, it made it that much harder. Now, we can clearly see the difference between black people and slavery and white immigrants who voluntarily came over here as indentured servants. Now, that does not mean that they were treated fairly or treated right, but you cannot compare the treatment that they received and that black people received. And most European immigrants, they were promised land if they came over here and worked for a certain period of time, and they called it the head right system. But they also weren't getting what they were promised either. And that doesn't mean that slave owners didn't treat white servants harshly, right? We saw the John Punch case where 3 servants ran away, 2 were white and 1 was black. But the difference is the 2 white servants only got 4 additional years of servitude. The black man was enslaved for life. And that was essentially already the difference. Now, one story a lot of people like to use to say black and white people were treated the same was the story about Bacon's Rebellion. Now, how many of you have heard about Bacon's Rebellion? Now, I like to call Nathaniel Bacon the original John Brown. And if you know me, then you know that's not a compliment. But in 1676, Nathaniel Bacon led a revolt, Bacon's Rebellion, that ended with Jamestown burned to the ground.
Bacon's Rebellion led to tighter British control of the colony. It may also have hastened the movement toward a labor system based on black slavery. Some historians argue that the Virginia planters, fearing another insurrection by the frontier white servants, began to turn to Africa for laborers. The strategy was to divide blacks and whites by creating an artificial color line. It's at this moment when race and racism radically alters the system of forced labor that had been practiced by human civilizations for thousands of years by injecting race into the equation. Again, Tim Wise explains.
So there was no white race, but in the colonies of what would become the United States, what did we see in the 1660s, 1670s? We began to see that Africans of indentured servant status realized, as did the white indentured servants, the Europeans who hadn't even been called white yet, that they had a lot of things in common, like the fact that they were all getting their clock cleaned by the elite. And so they would get together more than our history books taught us to foment rebellion against the elite, to try to get a better deal for themselves on the basis of economic necessity and economic justice. And what did the elite do? When you see that you're outnumbered by black and white folks who are penniless, landless, peasants, you have to do one of 2 things. You either have to kill them all, but you can't do that because who's going to work? Rich folks weren't going to. They had to get poor people to work. The whole point was to be a person of leisure back in those days. That was the goal, was not to work. So you couldn't kill them all. You didn't want to kill them all. You had to do the work yourself. You had to build your own levee, build your own house. No. Pick your own tobacco, harvest your own cotton. No, we're not going to do any of that. So you can't kill them, but you can co-opt them. And so the elite in Virginia, for example, in the colony, begins to give certain carrots to people of European descent, saying things like, we're going to let you own a little land, not much, but just a little. And we're going to get rid of indentured servitude. Now you're free labor. And by the way, once you're free labor, you get 50 acres of land. Just because you're free labor, see? So we're going to cut you in on this deal. We're going to let you enter into contracts. We're going to let you testify in court. And here's the best of all. We're going to put you on the slave patrol to keep those people in line, right? The idea was you're still going to get your clock cleaned. We still don't like you. We still aren't going to really empower you or change your economic subordination. But we're going to make you honorary members of this team, and you're going to help us keep those other people down. And so they got a little taste of power, and it did effectively divide and conquer those coalitions. Those rebellions began to stop almost instantly.
Now, y'all know I like to take away certain talking points, especially the talking points that create the white savior complex. And I think with the Bacon's Rebellion, this white savior complex kicks in with a lot of people. And a lot of people try to say, well, black and white people united to fight back. And it's about classism and not racism. And they point to this story. But the truth is, we already clearly see differences in race and how people are treated. But some people just have to give him credit for uniting black and white people through classism. And in a way, for the people who were fighting, it may or may not have been about class. But for Nathaniel Bacon, it was not. Now, this dude was born to wealthy parents, and he was always privileged. His parents paid his way into Cambridge where he could study law, and then they financed this trip for him to get to Virginia. And when he got here, he may have been the governor's cousin or something like that, but he used his privilege to get onto the governor's council. Now, while he was on the governor's council, do you think he said anything about class? No. Do you think he said anything about the privilege that he had over poor whites and poor black people? No, because his intention was never about classism. Because he enjoyed his status while it lasted. But the problem was him and the governor constantly argued over how they should handle the Indian situation. Now, this dude, Nathaniel Bacon, wanted to go out and slaughter more Indians so they could take more land. But the governor did not want a war with the Indians. And at this time, it was a brief time of peace as they focused their attention on enslaving black folk. And oftentimes, they used native tribes to help them fight rebellions or to catch runaway slaves. So the governor would not allow him to just go out there attacking Indians. And that's when this dude, Nathaniel Bacon, decided to rebel. He didn't care how the rich people treated the poor, especially when he was one of them. He didn't care how Negroes were treated. He didn't care about class or any of that. He started his rebellion so that he can go and kill more Indians and steal more land. Now, he did play on a lot of issues that poor whites were facing and saying, look how horrible these elites are treating you. But he didn't say his ulterior motive. And he also promised freedom to slaves if they helped him. And the first thing he did once he built the army of white servants, black servants, and black slaves, the very first thing he did was lead them to go slaughter a bunch of Indians. So when the governor found out, he ordered them to stop and sent troops to go stop them. But they heard about it before the troops got there and they was able to avoid them. So then in response, the dude Nathaniel Bacon and his army marched to the governor's doorstep and they burnt down Jamestown along the way. Now, after he burned down Jamestown, most of the white people didn't want any more parts of it, and he lost a lot of supporters. But he was still doing good until he died of diarrhea. But even though his intention was never to solve class, he didn't care about how Negroes were treated. Somehow people still have to give him credit due to the white savior complex, in my opinion. And people find a way to worship him as a hero when he was not. His goal was just to slaughter more Indians and take more land. And he was one of the very rich elite that people say he was going against. But his rebellion did cause panic, and Europeans ended the head right system after his rebellion because they knew they could not fulfill all the land that they had promised. Now, even though Nathaniel Bacon was a white dude, Virginia decided to pass multiple laws against black people in retaliation. Now, whether free or enslaved, black people, of course, were forbidden from owning weapons. Slaves had to have a pass to travel anywhere. But most importantly, they were now restricted from gathering in groups, even during a funeral. And anyone who was found guilty could be sentenced up to 20 lashes. And of course, by 1682, black people's right to self-defense was completely outlawed. And if anybody tried or was accused of it, they could be sentenced to 30 lashes, anywhere up to death. Now, we talked about the Dutch earlier, and between 1682 and 1685, they also passed a series of slave codes. The first thing they did was attack black people's ability to support themselves economically. They outlawed Europeans from doing commerce or trade with Negroes, whether free or enslaved. They made it illegal for slaves to trade or sell goods with anybody. And like in Virginia, they were outlawed from owning weapons or meeting up in groups. And to this day, we still hear people saying 3 or more black people together is considered a gang. Now, by 1690, slavery in every colony was fully established. And in South Carolina, the British introduced one of the slave codes that was already in effect in Barbados. And they introduced the Act for Better Ordering of Slaves, which essentially called for corporal punishment. The act allowed them to brand slaves, slit their noses, and just do other emasculating punishments designed to break their will. Now, by this point, slave owners were heavily outnumbered, and it allowed them to protect themselves, and it was the beginning of uniting with poor whites, which basically gave them status over black people. And they obviously still enjoy it to this day. Now, since they were outnumbered, they started hiring poor whites and giving them jobs as the slave patrol, and essentially just to keep black people in check.
And laws on their own being insufficient, authorizing any adult white man to enforce those laws, but then the reliance on individual action proving insufficient, forming into this body called the slave patrols that were an offshoot of the militia and worked as kind of a voluntary compulsory organization, meaning that participation was mandatory, but it wasn't a professional outfit. That provided a way of making the entire white male population directly involved in maintaining the slave society. As industrialization came to the South and there were larger slave populations in southern cities, the slave patrols moved similarly into the city. And there they became professionalized, and very quickly their duties expanded and they became a body that we would immediately recognize as a modern police force.
South Carolina was one of the first states to establish slave patrols. All white men were required to serve on a slave patrol, regardless of whether they could afford to own a slave or not. Patrollers were assigned to a specific location, known as a beat. Enslaved blacks were required to have a pass from their slave owners anytime they traveled off the plantation. Even with the pass, slave patrollers could choose to whip or beat the enslaved person for any reason. Slave cabins could be searched at any time. Sometimes it was because the slave patrollers heard music or the cabin lights were on. Sometimes it was because there were no lights on. Enslaved women often reported abuses from the slave patrollers once they entered their cabins. If an African American resisted the demands of the slave patrollers, the patrollers could assault or even kill without consequence.
Nigga good, nigga love is Sunday, you run, nigga run. Powder don't get you run, nigga run, you better get away. Nigga run, nigga good, nigga love is Sunday, you run, nigga run. Powder don't get you run, nigga run, you better get away. Nigga run by my gate, wake up nigga, you slept too late. Run, nigga run, powder don't get you run, nigga run, better get away. Look down yonder, what I see, great big nigga behind that tree. Run, nigga run, powder don't get you run, nigga run, you better get away.
And understand this, our melanin is a blessing and it was designed to protect us. But for the first time, probably in history, a group of people was subjugated just because of the color of their skin. But in a way, it led to more unity amongst black people who realized they had to stick together. And it led to the first all-black slave revolts. Now, the first all-black slave rebellion on record, or at least slave conspiracy on record, was in Westmoreland, Virginia in 1687. Now, it's not clear if it was an actual plot or just white paranoia, but a white servant named Nicholas Spencer claimed he heard about a slave conspiracy to rise up, and so he told the governor. Now, during this time, it was already a debate about slaves getting too much freedom, especially on the weekend, Saturday and Sunday. And so they decided to use this conspiracy to prove a point. Now, even though there's no records of a court case, most likely everybody who they suspected was involved was killed. And then the next year in 1688, an enslaved man named Sam was charged with promoting a Negro insurrection in the colony, even though there was no proof. but they convicted him. Now, they whipped him and other people who they accused of being involved, but Sam had to wear a heavy iron collar on his neck for the rest of his life, and if he ever took it off or stepped foot off the plantation, he was to be hung. But no matter what kind of punishments they used or what kind of laws they passed, black people always continued to fight back. In 1691, an enslaved man named Mingo managed to escape, and after he escaped, he was able to unite a large group of rebels and convince them to attack plantations throughout counties in Virginia.
This took place in like Middlesex County, Virginia. Like a lot of these rebellions took, on the plantation across Virginia, the upper South. The Untold Rebellion of Mingo in Virginia, 1691. Large numbers of slaves ravaged plantations. And, I just got to give a salutation out to Mingo and his comrades. A slave named Mingo, who had fled his master in Middlesex County, Virginia, gathered a large number of followers and ravaged plantations, particularly in Rappahannock County. These Negroes not only took cattle and hogs, but 2 guns, a carbine, and other things. What became of this incident, of this rebellion, was not recorded. And this is from the Miss Order book, Middlesex County, 1680 to 1694. This is the timeline of the John Nickerson resistance and the Mingo resistance. In 1687, John Nickerson is arrested by Middlesex County authorities and charged with leading a conspiracy of servants and slaves on Ralph Wormley plantation. The court decision is recorded in Middlesex County Order book, but his fate remains unknown. 1689, the second resistance and rebellion to try to take place on Wormley's plantation was 2 slaves, Mingo and his comrade Lawrence, and a servant named Richard Wilkins escaped from Ralph Wormley's estate in Middlesex County. They gathered followers and for 2 years raided plantations in Rappahannock County, stealing livestock, arms, ammunition, and goods. Later on, Mingo and Lawrence are captured and tried in Middlesex County Court for the theft of firearms. Little is known that what happened and what took place after this rebellion was, stopped, suppressed, and these comrades captured. It is believed that Mingo was hanged, and they believe that Lawrence was hanged. And the whereabouts of Richard Wilkinson afterwards is unknown. From what is told in the stories, that perhaps he was sold into where he was given more indentured service time.
Now, for 2 years, they destroyed plantations in 3 counties, including Middlesex and Rappahannock counties. And, they was taking livestock, guns, weapons, anything they needed. And it lasted for 2 years before it finally stopped. But there was at least 84 rebellions in Virginia alone. Now, all of them may not have been successful, but they continued to fight. So in response, Virginia started to create a systematic plan to stop runaways and rebellions. And even though a slave owner had to be compensated if a slave was injured or killed, they encouraged the slave patrol or paddy rollers to use violence or any means necessary to keep Negroes in their place. And if a slave owner wanted to free a slave, they were responsible for getting them out the colony within 6 months. And they also started to pass a bunch of anti-miscegenation laws. If a white person married a black person, they had to leave the colony within 3 months. And if a white woman had a mulatto child, they were forced to pay a fine of 15 pounds of tobacco. And if they couldn't pay it, which they often couldn't, they had to serve at least 5 years in servitude. Now, the children with white moms and black dads had to serve 30 years of servitude, and often they were enslaved for life. And as for slaves, Virginia denied them the right to a jury trial if they were accused of a crime, and they couldn't even own horses, cattle, a hog, or even pets. Imagine that. It's illegal for you to have a pet dog or even a goldfish. That's how sick it was. You could be punished for having a pet. Now, down in South Carolina in 1694, apparently they finally learned how to cultivate rice. But that led to a rise in a demand for slaves in South Carolina. Now, of course, we already know we've been cultivating rice for a long time. Even when the Portuguese first arrived in the 1440s, they reported seeing large fields. But anyway, as the demand for slaves in South Carolina began to rise, the Royal African Company lost their monopoly with the English. Now, by the 1700s, the Pilgrims already legalized and regulated their own slave trade in Pennsylvania. And as a side note, Delaware broke off in 1701 and became its own colony, but they still kept Pennsylvania's slave codes, which included the Act of 1700. Now, this act included harsher punishments for resisting, including whipping, up to castration, and even death. No black person, free or enslaved, could have a jury trial if they were accused of a crime. And if a white woman accused them of rape, it was automatic death. And just like Virginia, they banned weapons, and of course, slaves couldn't meet in groups of more than 4. Now, the Dutch in New Amsterdam passed similar laws, but instead of groups of 4, it couldn't be more than 3. And we know 3 is a gang. And if anybody was found guilty, they could be punished up to 40 lashes. And on top of that, slave owners can punish them however they wanted, except for cutting off a limb or killing them. And not only could slaves not engage in any kind of commerce, they weren't even allowed to go to the homes of a free black person, even if they may have been their family. And in order to keep slave owners from giving slaves freedom, New Amsterdam requires slave owners to pay 50 pounds of tobacco before they release a slave, just to ensure they never would do it. Now, even though they were cruel, Connecticut had to pass a law requiring slave owners to take care of old and disabled slaves. But you already know that law was barely enforced. And oftentimes, they didn't take care of slaves if they couldn't profit off of them. So older slaves or disabled slaves were often treated harshly and were given less than others. Now, I know today we talked about a lot of the laws, so I don't want to go too far. But I do think it's important for us to look at these laws to see if they're still in effect today and how. And just looking at how these laws played a role in creating the institution that we know as slavery, and how a lot of these laws built the institutions that we see today. So before we end this session, there's one more major law that I want to look at, as well as the response by a lot of the enslaved populations. Now, we started with the Casual Killing Act in Virginia, and as we move into the 1700s, Virginia continued the trend after they passed the slave codes of 1705, or otherwise known as an act concerning servants and slaves. And despite the name, it did affect free black people as well.
Virginia didn't just stop there. In 1705, Virginia passed another law dedicated to regulating the movement and behavior of enslaved people. It was called an Act Concerning Servants and Slaves. This act banned black people from owning white servants and penalized those who presided over the marriage between a white and black person. It banned enslaved people from owning weapons. Other laws around the same time banned black people, regardless of their servitude status, from testifying against whites in court. You might think that in a country where those same colonists would soon be demanding freedom while espousing the importance of liberty and equality for themselves, that those same people would be a bit more, concerned about liberty and equality for everyone. But the truth is, America's promise and America's actions are very often inconsistent. Let's go to the thought bubble. In 1671, Maryland passed a law stating that even if an enslaved person converted to Christianity, that conversion did not change their servitude status. This was important because of the legal debate around whether Christians could be enslaved. In a place like South Carolina, well, they built a whole society around slave codes. They did it, as they all did, for both economic and societal reasons. These codes banned black people from engaging in any type of trade, did not allow for enslaved folks to travel without notes from their enslaver, banned enslaved black Americans from keeping loud instruments like drums and horns, and gave law enforcement the authority to search enslaved black people and to whip them if they appeared to be engaging in what was deemed disorderly behavior. Many of these codes showed up after slave rebellions, when enslavers were particularly interested in protecting themselves and their property from enslaved people who wanted their freedom.
Now, the slave codes of 1705 forbid free black people from running for public office or testifying in court against a white person, even if they committed a crime against them. You still couldn't testify against the white person. Of course, black people, free or enslaved, couldn't have weapons or defend themselves even if they were being attacked. Virginia also imposed a 9 o'clock curfew on the free black population and on Indians. And this law also put a lot of free black people in danger because since slaves were required to have a pass if they were off the plantation, and if they got caught without a pass and they couldn't name their slave owner, then they became property of the state. So if a free black person was accused of being a slave and they couldn't name a slave owner, they were automatically property of the state. The slave codes of 1705 also doubled down on anti-miscegenation laws. And if a minister married a mixed couple, they were fined in 10,000 pounds of tobacco. Now, one of the most important things about these slave codes, it defined the status of a slave as a non-Christian, aka a non-white. So basically, only blacks, mulattoes, and in some cases, Indians were to be slaves, and white people were never to be slaves, although they still could be servants. Now, you see, they continue to say Christian, non-Christian, which basically means white. And we see that white is becoming a thing. Now, some say the first time white was used was in a play in the early 1600s. But we already see whiteness developing, even though it's still an exclusive club. Now, the first time you see white in the law was in an anti-miscegenation law in Maryland in 1681. And the law banned marriage between whites and non-whites. But essentially, Negroes were considered savages and basically animals. Therefore, we couldn't be Christians, but we were only property. Even after the 1705 slave codes, Virginia continued to use the threat of an uprising to pass more laws. Now, in some cases, they were just paranoid, but sometimes the threat was real. But a lot of times, the threat ended before it could start, usually because of snitches. And we still see this same problem today. As hard as it was for black people to communicate, regardless of whatever language barriers may or may not exist, they still worked together and found a way to communicate, to fight back. And sometimes, many times, a slave who looked just like them would be the first one to turn them in for his own selfish gain. On Easter Sunday in 1710, an all-black revolt was set to take place, but a slave named Will betrayed them in exchange for freedom and 40 pounds of tobacco. And I'm not sure how much that helped him or his descendants. And even though it may not be tobacco today, we still see some of the same behavior with some people betraying their people for money or whatever it may be. Now, the Dutch in New Amsterdam followed suit with Virginia and passed stricter laws against runaways. In 1706, they legalized the death penalty for runaway slaves, or if a black person fought or defended themselves, or if they happened to kill someone white, it was automatic death. But in 1711, the Dutch in New Amsterdam took it even further. When white people started complaining about the amount of Negroes in New York, they passed a law saying all Negro slaves were to be hired, aka purchased, at the market house at the Wall Street Slip. This was the first official market for buying and selling human beings.
The buying and selling of stocks and bonds is the business that made Wall Street world-renowned. But a century before the arrival of a financial market in the late 1700s, this famous row was the site of a slave market, a center to exchange commodities more precious than gold, kidnap slaves who went on to build the city. From Broadway to City Hall, Visual markers point to historically significant sites across this American city. Soon, a new memorial will pay homage to the people who laid its foundation.
1711, there's a brisk business in slaves, both in purchase and rental of slave labor. What happens is the boats come right up to the Wall Street grain market. In 1711, the town council, called the Common Council, decides that to coordinate the sale and rental of enslaved Africans, and really to make sure that they keep track and to prevent rebellion, all sale and rental of enslaved Africans will take place at the Wall Street slave market, right over here. And again, it was documented in the minutes of the town council. And in this curriculum that we developed, we include it. But there was never a marker here.
Back in June, New York Mayor Bill de Blasio dedicated this plaque steps away from what was once the Wall Street slave market. The plaque honors those who passed through the slave market, located near Pearl and Water Streets. During a memorial, the mayor said it was true 3 centuries ago, even though it was never acknowledged. It was true then, it is true today. It will be true tomorrow.
Basically, the first commodity of Wall Street was black men, women, and children who were being traded and sold. Wall Street began as nothing but a slave market. And we already know about how many of the Jewish merchants and Dutch merchants were the ones responsible. But still, black people in New York fought back from day one. In 1708, 4 slaves killed at least 7 people during an uprising in Long Island. But it didn't stop there, and some say the first successful all-black rebellion was the New York Slave Rebellion of 1712. Now, these slaves freed themselves, armed themselves with guns, knives, swords, hatchets, whatever weapons they could find. So they planned to set businesses, homes, and other buildings on fire. And then they waited. And every white person that came to put the fires out, they killed them. And by the end, they at least killed 9 people and wounded 6 more before they were able to escape. Now, Europeans were already paranoid, as they should be, because black people definitely was ready to fight back. And this uprising caused a massive panic, and most of the white residents just went on a witch hunt. Every black male 14 and up in the area was arrested, was harassed, or was questioned. And by the end, they arrested about 70 black people without any evidence.
In the early 18th century in New York, shortly after British rule started, there was a shipment of enslaved people into New York. They were Akan from present-day Ghana. We believe that they had already been in battles in Ghana. When they came to New York, they decided to rebel against slavery. One night, they started a series of fires, and when whites came out of their houses, they attacked them. I think they hoped to kill enough whites and then gain their freedom. They also hoped to invoke an uprising among other enslaved people. They were quickly outnumbered by the white residents. They were captured, and many of them were executed. Every slave conspiracy has an effect on the slave society. Most immediately, the punishment of those enslaved people, selling them away, often very far away into places that are much more harsh, the execution of those accused, and the tightening of laws.
Now, of the 70 people who were arrested, 27 were charged. And of that, 21 were convicted and sentenced to death. Now, they burnt most of these people alive, whether they were involved or not, without any evidence. But they burnt most of them alive. But the last one was executed on a breaking wheel in public to send a message. And if you don't know what a breaking wheel is, you should definitely look it up, because it's sick and just a sick form of punishment. But of course, New York passed even more laws against black people, and free black people were restricted from owning or inheriting land now. So black people, even if they were free, they could no longer pass down what they had to their children. And we all know how much land and resources affect generational wealth. But people aren't just going to take it. They're going to fight back. They're going to try to escape. They're going to do everything they can to survive. And not only survive, but to get out of the situation that they're in by any means necessary. And so many enslaved people were escaping from New York to Canada. And New York ended up legalizing the execution of anyone caught 40 miles north of Albany. Now, I don't want to go too far since we covered a lot of laws, and I don't want to make it too dragged out. But, you know, I think it's important to know about the Casual Killing Act and the slave codes and how they shaped the black experience in America. And also how black people were willing to fight back no matter what they were trying to do. We also saw the first John Brown, which was Nathaniel Bacon, which a lot of people misconstrue the story. Like I said, that's a part of that white savior complex that we see. And we see how no matter where we are, New York, Virginia, South Carolina, the people were willing to fight. And it's important that we know about our rebellions and the times that we fought. And it's important to know the tactics they used against us, because oftentimes they repeat the same tactics to this day. Now, we'll continue next week, and we'll try to focus less on laws, and we'll get back to more of the rebellions, along with the creation of whiteness itself, because we still see they're using Christian, but we're going to start seeing them transition to white. So we'll get into more of that and more of the response from black people globally, not just in America. So I want to thank everybody for tuning in. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask. And I appreciate all the support. And I'll see y'all again next week. So as always, man, we have got to start standing for something, or we're going to keep falling for anything.